The average IQ in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa is under 75, which is considered mentally disabled.
So what is one of the big problems when you want to compare any sort of average IQ test or any sort of standardized testing scores across demographics? With the problem that you often run into, let's say right now I just ask you, okay, tell me who was the president of the United States during the American Civil War, right? If you're an immigrant from Malaysia, that's going to be a very difficult question for you to answer, as opposed if you are a native-born American, right? Most Americans are going to say, okay, that was Abraham Lincoln, right? But then even within that American history, if I'm to ask you, okay, tell me about Frederick Douglass, tell me what was his birthday, where is he from, etc. Very difficult, right? Because if you're from California versus if you're from New York, someone from New York is probably much more likely to know that Frederick Douglass is from New York because Frederick Douglass is from New York. And then if I'm to be like, okay, compare that versus how a white kid might answer that question versus a black kid versus a Hispanic kid versus an Asian kid, right? Frederick Douglass is much more part of civil rights history, Black American history, so Black Americans would likely more likely know that answer, right? And so there's this cultural bias that's within these tests, right? It's typically biased towards whatever the dominant culture is, where the test is being administered, or if it's a global international test, there still is some sort of cultural bias typically to whatever the most dominant culture is, internationally speaking. So another problem that you run into, even when you try to control for these cultural biases, is that if you look at the US, for example, if you just look at white kids and you look at black kids, right, of the same familial income, right, the families have the same amount of income, what you find is black kids are still going to be exposed to much higher levels of lead, right? And lead is one of those contaminants where lead's very neurodegenerative, so the outcomes of people who consume more lead, especially in early ages, they'll have much more impaired cognitive abilities later in life, and they'll have much different behavioral outcomes and what have you. So, and you might ask, okay, why do black kids have so much more lead than white kids, even if you control for income? Well, black kids, even controlled for income, still live in communities that were often redlined in the past. Redlining pushed populations, black populations, into areas with older infrastructure, older pipes, much more lead, and other contaminants that we just don't have in more modern buildings.